Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jim Morrison, and I want to welcome you all to the first event in our commemoration of the 400th anniversary of the landing of Captain John Smith in Cohasset Harbor, the first European to be here. And we have an exciting day of events, of which this is only the first. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to simply give a little review of what we're going to be doing for the rest of the day. We will be speaking here until about, I'd say probably about 2:15. And then at 2:30 down at Private John W. Sidney Square, which is right across from the entrance to the Cohasset Harbor Inn. There will be a performance by the Wampanoag Nation singers and dancers, and a bread baking demonstration of native recipes, and which will be very, very interesting on both accounts. At 3:30, we have scheduled the arrival of Captain John Smith, or an interpreter who is going to be reenacting the landing, and he will have a few words, in fact, maybe a little more than a few words, to share with us about his perspective on what he did and what were the subsequent consequences of that. Followed by the commemoration ceremony of the dedication of the plaque that we have created for the 400th anniversary. And Chris Sr., our town manager, will be the master of ceremonies, and we'll have citations and proclamations from the town and state officials and the acceptance of the plaque by town officials. And those of you with children may be interested in the fact that there's a Coast Guard vessel that is down at the wharf there that the children can go on and see, and adults can do that too. I'd like to introduce our distinguished speakers for today. First of all, I'd like to introduce Linda Coombs, who is an author and an historian from the Wampanoag tribe of Gayhead, Aquina, and she's dedicated to preserving her people's culture and traditions. Her writings include children's books on Native American culture and essays on colonial history from a Native American perspective. Ms. Coombs grew up on Martha's Vineyard and graduated from the University of Massachusetts Lowell in 1971 with a degree in music education. She began her career at the Boston Children's Museum, interning in its Native American program. She went on to work at Plymouth Plantation and served 15 years as Associate Director of the Wampanoag Indigenous Program. Currently, she's Program Director of the Aquina Cultural Center. We also have Professor Neal Salisbury, who is Professor Emeritus of History at Smith College. He's an authority on the history of Indigenous Americans in the Northeast between 1500 and 1800 and colonial revolutionary North America. Among his publications are Manitou and Providence, Indians, Europeans, and the Making of New England, 1500 to 1643, which was published by Oxford University Press in 1982. Also, A Companion to American Indian History, co-edited with Philip J. Deloria, which was published by Blackwell in 2002, and Reinterpreting New England Indians and Colonial Experience, co-edited with Colin G. Calloway, published by the Colonial Society of Massachusetts in 2003. Professor Salisbury is past president of the American Society for Ethnohistory and has served on the council of the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture. In 2013, he co-directed a summer institute for school teachers titled Native Americans at New England, a historical overview, and in spring 2014 taught a colloquium, Cross-Cultural Captivity in Historical Perspective, 1500 to 1860. So today, Professor Salisbury will speak first, followed by Ms. Coombs, and then we will have a joint question and answer session afterwards. So without further ado, I'd like to present to you Professor Neal Salisbury.
Thank you, Jim. How's the sound working back? Back there. Good? Great. Well, thank you again, and thank you all for coming out today. Thanks. I'll put it here to avert any further tragedies in the history of Cohasset. I really want to thank both the Historical Commission and the Historical Society for getting together and having us out here today. I'm really honored to be part of this remembering of a very important event that took place here 400 years ago. It's great to be on the program with Linda Coombs, with whom I've been on many programs over the years. As a sort of academic historian, I usually write and or teach about a big picture, usually at least as big as colonial New England, and sometimes extending beyond that to both in time and space. But I always enjoy coming to local communities, both Indian and non-Indian, because people in local communities always know all this little detailed stuff that those of us who work on the big picture just don't always get to. And so every time I come to a place like this, I learn, and I've already learned, even in less than 24 hours here, a lot more than I already knew. So I hope today I can return the favor by trying to outline what I see as the big picture within which John Smith came here in 1614. The more familiar big picture usually depicts Smith and others, explorers like him, as striving to realize their vision of a new society, stripped of old world corruption in a new world wilderness, to use a term that a lot of the English writers used at the time. If native peoples appear at all in these stories, at least some of them welcome and even help the newcomers get started. But whether welcoming or resisting, the natives soon disappear while real history proceeds. So what I want to do today is to offer a more complicated version of that picture, giving some attention to the backgrounds of the Wampanoag, Massachusetts, and other nearby Native Americans, and to Smith and other Europeans, whom the natives could no longer ignore after 1600. From 1600, we'll follow events more closely, including Cohasset and beyond to the early 1620s. There are many characters in this picture, not only John Smith, but others with names like Wampanoag, Samuel de Champlain, Tisquantum, and Sir Ferdinando Gorges. Even Pocahontas will appear briefly in one of the subplots. These stories have moments of humor, usually ironic humor, alongside corruption, deceit, violence, senseless tragedy, qualities found in many of the plays that William Shakespeare was then presenting on the English stage. But let's begin by looking at what we know concretely about the Englishman John Smith at Cohasset, from which, of course, the town name of Cohasset was later derived. The only information we have about this visit is from Smith himself. He first mentions it in his description of New England, published 2 years later, saying of the Indians, speaking about Massachusetts Bay in general, "We found them very kind, but in their fury no less valiant. For upon a quarrel we had with one of them, he and 3 others crossed the harbor of Cohasset to certain rocks whereby we had to pass, and there let fly their arrows in exchange for our shot," meaning musket balls, "till we were out of danger." End quote. Smith also included a map of the region he named New England based on this expedition. Probably a lot of you have seen that, and it is on display at the Historical Society if you haven't had a chance to look at it. And it's a very important account, and I'll get back to how influential it was later on. But Smith wrote and rewrote his accounts over time, over the course of his career, integrating personal memoirs with historical compilations. And in 1624, he added slightly to that earlier description of the skirmish here at Cohasset. He said that one of the natives that they encountered, quote, was slain and another shot through his thigh, end quote. And it's a small addition, we might think, though we might wonder why 8 years and 2 editions later, an escape under fire included some native casualties. But let's leave that, we'll come back to that a little later on. For now, I think the thing to notice is that he presents this episode as a very minor one in his longer trip to New England, worth just one sentence in each of the 2 versions. But let's go back to the big picture and see where it fits in. Fundamental to that big picture, of course, are the native people and their long history in this region. Indigenous accounts usually associate the emergence of a people as one of a larger story of the creation, an integral part of the story of the creation of a homeland environment. That doesn't give us a precise date, but these accounts weren't about dates. They were about the people and the spiritual worlds they lived in. Yet even those archaeologists who insist that we must have a date somewhere or another, even the most conservative of those archaeologists would agree that human communities were ongoing in New England at least 11,000 years ago. Needless to say, the last 400 years out of 11,000 is a tiny drop in a very large bucket. By comparison, the continuous human occupation of the British Isles can only be dated to about 9,600 years ago. And the Norman conquest, which pointed England toward its future dynastic course, occurred just 948 years ago. A somewhat larger drop than 400 in that bucket. Well before then, the various languages of the Algonquian family had assumed the forms that Europeans would later encounter here, including Wampanoag or Massachusetts, which are one and the same language. As with all languages, modification of the Algonquian languages reflects the continual cultural modifications that people made over time. Through millennia, people interacted across geographic and linguistic boundaries, passing along and acquiring new ideas, new materials, new technologies that gave rise to new words and new worlds. While the Normans were conquering England, women here in southern New England were incorporating maize, beans, and squash, the 3 sisters of native spiritual traditions, into their cultivating practices. Maize had been domesticated in Mexico 8,000 years earlier, but its transformation to a primary food and its spread over much of the Western Hemisphere was a very long process, requiring indigenous farmers all along the way to experiment until they developed a variety that would flourish under local conditions, particularly shortened growing seasons. As the Normans were conquering England, women in the Northeast began producing enough corn and other crops to sustain their people through most of each winter. Now, men's hunting remained indispensable. In fact, it itself had become more effective a few centuries earlier as the bow and arrow arrived and ultimately came to the continent via Inuit people from Siberia who were moving in the Arctic. But the bow and arrow also spread throughout the hemisphere and certainly replaced the older sort of projectile point things that in turn when it came to hunting. So both of these practices were revolutionary, and both of them affected the communities in very fundamental ways. And particularly with the shift to intensive farming, communities became more concentrated. Populations began to rise exponentially to the levels recorded in those very earliest European accounts here. So I hope these points remind us that just how fundamentally misleading the term prehistory is, with the suggestion that some people, usually Europeans, experience history, while others, like Native Americans, are waiting for history to happen. But when we correlate archaeological and linguistic evidence along with European and Native accounts, we see that Native peoples had been making and experiencing history all along. We also see that they were more than prepared to interact with outsiders, because this is what they've been doing all along. Outsiders exchanging ideas, materials, and practices to selectively, of course, incorporate into their own cultures. On the other hand, anyone who tried to take more than they gave in an exchange could become targets of suspicion and even violence. And it's in this context that indigenous New Englanders began interacting with Europeans during the 16th century. Europeans began arriving here soon after Columbus' more famous landfall in 1492. The earliest evidence of contacts this far north is fragmentary. We see instances of European slave raiding as well as scattered appearance of European copper and iron objects, probably obtained from passing fishermen. The first extensive account of this part of New England by Giovanni de Verrazzano recorded his mostly friendly interactions with Wampanoag and Narragansett people in 1524. Over the rest of the 16th century, Europeans appeared even more frequently, ever more frequently, most often arriving in quest of furs, primarily beaver, as beaver hats had become a hot fashion item in Europe. Although their contacts were natives were often hostile, the most successful traders were those who figured out how to mesh their desires for profits with native expectations of reciprocity. By 1600, dozens of traders, mostly French and a few English, had established ties at coastal towns in New England where they visited annually, usually exchanging cloth, metal, and glass goods for pelts, plus corn and other provisions. What these early exchanges show us is that both Native and Europeans were capable of interacting on mutually respectful terms and of incorporating objects from one another into their own cultures. Yes, there were vast cultural differences between them, but these differences were not necessarily, by themselves, barriers to friendly relations and the pursuit of mutual interests. Now, after 1600, these promising interactions were supplemented by more direct interventions from nation states, specifically in this region, France, England, and the Netherlands. Each of these governments chartered private companies to establish a colonial presence in the Northeast. Both English and French companies repeatedly tried to colonize Wampanoag, Massachusetts country soon after the turn of the century. Samuel de Champlain met with hostility when French expeditions overrode, initially relations were friendly, but overrode native expectations finally with shows of force. After he erected a large cross at a Nauset Wampanoag town near present-day Chatham in 1606, the Nausets drove Champlain away and he retreated northward. And thereafter, the French relied on private traders and occasionally Micmac allies, raiding parties from what's now Nova Scotia, to obtain any furs they wanted from New England. English expeditions, though, were even more extreme than the French when it came to using force and intimidation against the Indians. Again, relationships often began on a friendly, if cautious note, but usually came to force when things got nasty. Bartholomew Gosnold in 1602 at Noepi, the future Martha's Vineyard, Martin Pring at the Nauset homeland on the Cape, both ended their expeditions after the English alienated their Wampanoag hosts by using violence to assure their cooperation. A common tactic was to seize native individuals and take them to England, expecting the captives to be so awestruck by England's size, power, and wealth that they would gladly escort their captors back home and persuade their people to submit to English authority. Many of the captives died from illnesses contracted in polluted, plague-ridden London or drowned at sea. Those who did return home usually found their people glad to see them, but seething with resentment against the English. Native hostility intensified in 1611 when an English expedition seized a half-dozen Abenakis and Wampanoags. Wampanoags were especially offended because one of the captives, Epino, was a revered and powerful sachem from Noepi, and we'll come back to him in a minute. Even English traders felt this heightened resentment, though. After 1611, only one Abenaki town at Pemaquid on the Maine coast continued trading with Englishmen, while all the rest dealt exclusively with the French. Meanwhile, Dutch traders, operating from their new base on the Hudson River, were establishing trade connections with native communities as close as Narragansett Bay at the western periphery of Wampanoag country. So English colonial prospects in New England were anything but bright when John Smith arrived in 1614. Before proceeding with the main story, let's pause in just a minute and ask just who Smith was and why he suddenly appeared in New England at this critical moment. Smith had been born about 34 years earlier in England. At age 16, he and many other Protestant men from England and the continent went to the Netherlands to join its war for independence from Catholic Spain. The experience whetted his appetite for combat as well as his ambition. A year after the Protestant victory, he returned to the continent. He spent 5 years abroad, which began and ended in the Mediterranean in what were basically pirate crews. But his later memoirs focused mainly on his fighting in Eastern Europe for Catholic Austria against the Ottoman Turks, a Muslim enemy that all Christian Europeans at the time agreed was an incarnation of evil. One of the local princes he fought under promoted him to the rank of captain, and another designated him, quote, an English gentleman. These are marks of status that Smith used after returning to England in 1605 in search of further opportunities. That opportunity came with his being hired by the Virginia Company to be part of an expedition to plant the now famous settlement at Jamestown in 1607. After a monumental series of blunders nearly wiped out the settlement at Jamestown, Smith took full charge. He determined that the settlement couldn't survive unless neighboring Powhatan Indians supplied it with corn. While leading an ill-conceived effort to obtain corn by force, Smith was captured by Powhatans. Now, supposedly, he was about to be executed when a smitten Pocahontas, beloved daughter of the Powhatan chief, threw herself upon him as the axe was about to fall. Yielding to his daughter's entreaties, the chiefs elected to spare Smith's life. Well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it probably didn't happen, and certainly didn't happen this way. Just to briefly summarize the main reasons to doubt the popular story. First, Smith never mentions the incident in any of his first 3 accounts of Virginia. He finally alludes to it in 1622, and then develops it fully in that 1624 edition, by which time Pocahontas, her later English husband John Rolfe, and anyone else who might have challenged his version were all dead. Second, the dramatic rescue parallels his account of captivity in Turkey when a lovely woman named Trabigzanda rescued him. She also went unmentioned until the 1620s. And 2 other episodes in which married women, one Russian, the other French, assisted him in moments of dire need. In fact, Pocahontas was probably about 10 years old when she rescued Smith. If anything resembling a rescue actually happened, it was probably an adoption ceremony, scripted in advance so that Smith would emerge owing the Powhatans some deference for their generosity, their magnanimity toward him. But deference to savages was not part of Smith's persona. So not something he would have mentioned if he even tried to understand it. Moreover, by the time Smith added Pocahontas to his accounts, English readers remembered her as the celebrity Indian princess who visited and tragically died in England 9 years after Smith left Virginia. Okay, so Smith left Virginia for England after being seriously injured in a gunpowder explosion in 1609. By then, the Virginia Company had published a letter he'd written describing the colony's first year and his role in rescuing it. And the publication's popularity made Smith realize that he could further his reputation through writing. In 1612, he published an extensive account of Virginia, along with an elaborate map combining geographic and ethnographic description and a narrative of English colonization, with, of course, himself at the center. Smith's tactics in Virginia had earned him a lot of detractors, and they now ran things there. So part of this was his way of pushing back against them. In any case, the book appealed to many other readers, including a merchant named Marmaduke Rawdon, who sent Smith with 2 ships to New England in 1614. That expedition was charged particularly with hunting whales and locating sources of gold and copper. Its fallback priorities would be trading for furs and fishing. As in Virginia, Smith would explore and report on the region, observing directly, but also using native informants to learn about them and about who and what lay in the interior. So that's how and why Smith arrived here in 1614. Excuse me. Focusing first on the main coast, his expedition found neither gold, nor copper, nor whales, and they collected just a few hundred beaver pelts that French traders had not already carried off for the year. So he then ordered the smaller of the 2 vessels in the expedition, under a man named Thomas Hunt, to fish, while he himself explored southward along the coast with the larger ship. Like the colonizers who preceded him, and as he himself did in Virginia, Smith sometimes secured natives' cooperation, at least momentarily, but just as often led them to withdraw, or in at least 2 cases, provoked them to violence. The skirmish here at Cohasset was repeated on a larger, bloodier scale a few days later at Patuxet, a Wampanoag town at the site of the future Plymouth colony. These encounters are hardly surprising, given what we know about the region's recent history and about Smith's own history. Now, Smith returned from this voyage after 4.5 months, but the expedition was not yet over, because he'd ordered Thomas Hunt, to continue fishing until his smaller vessel was full of fish, and then to carry the haul to Malaga, Spain, where English merchants regularly traded fish for wine. With Smith gone, Hunt devised a quicker way to fill his ship, with Wampanoags. Proceeding first to Patuxet and then to Nauset, he seized 25 to 30 captives, taking them to Malaga to sell as slaves. Some Catholic friars in Malaga, and we don't really know all the details here, but as much as we do know, some Catholic friars in Malaga bought at least one of these captives to Squantum, and perhaps some others as likely prospects for Christian conversion. The rest most likely ended up rowing galley ships in the Mediterranean, an occupation that few survived, as Smith certainly would have known from his earlier career. But Smith denounced Hunt because, in part, he said, the kidnappings generated the natives' hate against England and caused my proceedings, as he put it, to be more difficult. Now, Smith was hardly opposed to kidnapping Indians and sending them abroad. He'd done it himself in Virginia. But the violence at Patuxet had ended, he claimed, with a peaceful reconciliation. And this is probably true. It's unlikely that Hunt and his small crew could have captured at least as many Wampanoags as the number of crewmen themselves by force. More likely, they used the recent truce to lure the unwary natives aboard. From what we've seen, though, Smith didn't so much begin Indians' hate against England as revive it. And reinforcing that revival still further was a return just a few days later of Epanow, the Wampanoag sachem who'd been seized from Noepi 3 years earlier. Epanow was now the property of Sir Ferdinando Georges, head of the Plymouth Company, based in Plymouth, England, and the most ambitious would-be colonizer of what the English now called Northern Virginia. Georges had already been betrayed by Abenaki captives he thought were loyal, so he took great care with Epanow to avoid yet another disappointment. First, he housed the sachem in London, where, like other native captives, he was put on public display as a means of attracting both investors and a public hungry for a taste of the exotic. Of all such captives, Epanow was the most popular yet, for his physical prowess, his dignified bearing, and his willingness to oblige his audiences. Georges reported that, quote, he learned so much English as to bid those that wondered at him, welcome, welcome. Most scholars agree that Shakespeare probably had Epanow in mind when in Henry VIII, first staged while Epanow was nearby, a character wonders aloud whether so many women are besieging the court now to see, quote, some strange Indian with the great tool, end quote.
Excuse me, did you say that Epanow was from Aquina? Because he was.
I was using Noepi, the name of
The whole
island.
island, he was
Specifically from Aquina. Okay, good. Thank you. I'd never nailed that one down. Georges soon moved his captive to quieter Plymouth, where he and his investors quizzed the sachem about every conceivable detail relating to his homeland. The process deepened Epanow's familiarity with his hosts and their peculiarities. In particular, they kept asking about a bright, shiny mineral they called gold. Sensing a near obsession with the topic, Epanow assured his hosts that he would lead them to the rich gold fields of Wampanoag country. Virtually certain of Epanow's sincerity and loyalty, Georges sent him home, though not without ordering an armed guard as they approached the island. Once it had anchored offshore, joyous Wampanoags clambered aboard. Besides exchanging greetings, Epanow and his people discussed other matters. Unbeknownst to the English, I'd made him bilingual, but hadn't thought to do the same for any of their own. So, the next day, as Wampanoag canoes approached the ship, the boatmen in the canoes rose up, and under cover of a great volley of arrows, Epanow dove off the ship and swam to safety. The English returned fire, and both sides suffered losses. But in the end, the Wampanoags had their sachem back, while Georges's men limped home empty-handed. Well, the disappointing endings of their latest ventures discouraged neither Smith nor Georges. In fact, they joined forces to try and establish a settlement in New England like the one in Virginia. Smith would work from the relative safety of Pemaquid. From there, moved southward, gradually consolidating Indian support by collecting corn, as he did in Virginia, more than furs, until reaching the hottest flashpoint, Wampanoag country. There would be fishing and whaling, but no gold hunting this time. Smith set sail, but he never made it. Georges, the funding really wasn't quite up to the task. The ship had to turn back once for repairs. Then pirates attacked, but they withdrew when they realized they'd served with Smith back in his Mediterranean days. Finally, French forces captured the ship and imprisoned Smith for several months before he was able to return to England. Well, to hasten his next job, or next commission, Smith published that description of New England, along with the most detailed map yet produced by any European of this region. These maps are certainly, and his accounts, are much more limited than the accounts of Virginia because whereas in Virginia he spent 2 years and did travel into the interior to some degree, in this case he was here for just 4.5 months and really never got very far inland at all. Whatever he wrote about the interior was what he learned from his native informants. But Smith did in this book make a very persuasive case that New England could prove as rewarding a place for settlement as Virginia, which was at that time was still struggling. But Georges and others carefully studied Smith's books and maps. They never again invited him to lead their efforts. As in Virginia, he seems to have alienated almost everyone he worked with. He was knowledgeable, capable, but always quick to find fault in others while finding none in his own many mistakes. So it would be other Georges H's who witnessed what proved to be the decisive and catastrophic turning point in the history we've been reviewing. In 1616, an outbreak of what one of them called the plague tore through native communities at least as far northward as Penobscot River and southward through Wampanoag country. And epidemic disease, continued to sweep the region for another 2 years. Whether the plague persisted that long or other diseases followed isn't clear. Fragmented second-hand accounts list symptoms suggesting yellow fever, hepatitis, and numerous other possibilities to medical historians, leading them all to disagree with one another about what happened. Most likely, Smith was right when he stated that 3 consecutive epidemics had struck. Perhaps the plague left surviving natives all the more vulnerable to other microbes. We certainly know that many died not directly from diseases themselves, but from exposure and malnutrition in its aftermath. We also know that no French or English witness contracted the disease. Nor in this case, as opposed to later on, nor in this case did Narragansett and other native peoples of the West, whose only European contacts thus far had been with the Dutch. In other words, the epidemic struck native communities that had been interacting willingly or unwillingly with French and English for the preceding decade and a half. Post-epidemic European reports describe not a virgin land, as it's often called, but in the words of historian Francis Jennings, a widowed land. Most of the populous villages that Champlain and Smith had described and put on their maps were emptied, with the 10% of those who survived clustering in small villages of just a few dozen. One Englishman estimated that the emptied town of Patuxent had previously been home to 2,000 people. Another talked about overgrown fields covered in bones and skulls. The largest of 3 surviving Massachusetts communities nearby on the Cohasset River had just 50 to 60 residents, certainly including Cohasset survivors. Well, to Sir Ferdinand of Georges, this catastrophe represented not a tragedy, but an opportunity. In 1619, he sent one Thomas Dermer with yet another native informant to Squantum, the Patuxet who'd been taken to Malaga and rescued by friars. Through a very long story I won't rehearse, Squantum eventually ended up in England and met up with Georges. Squantum helped Dermer, so Georges sends them back together. Squantum helps Dermer establish ties with a couple of communities before, with Dermer's permission, he leaves the English in order to search for any surviving Patuxets. Without Squantum, Dermer found that while the Wampanoag's numbers had been severely reduced, their memories of the English were alive and well. After being captured on the Cape, Dermer was taken to Epinow, the one-time Georges captive, who took great pleasure in recounting how he had humiliated Dermer's employer 5 years earlier. Dermer finally made it back to England and sailed again for Georges in the summer of 1620, only to find that Anglo-Wampanoag relations had deteriorated still further. Another English crew had recently arrived, and after inviting some Wampanoags aboard, shot them in cold blood. Dermer was captured again. Squantum reappeared and secured his release. Together, they then sailed around to Aquina, where Epinow and his people attacked them, killing most of the English, mortally wounding Dermer, and seizing the now distrusted Squantum. When the Mayflower arrived at what had recently been Patuxet, just 4 months later, they carried a copy of a deathbed letter that Dermer wrote to Georges. Dermer describes conditions in the region as he left it. He advises locating the first plantation at Patuxent, which, as he says, in Captain Smith's map is called Plymouth. He continues, the soil there is hardy but strong. It's the abandoned home of the loyal Tisquantum, and it's a safe distance from the Wampanoag town at Pokanoka, whose inhabitants in the wake of the epidemics, quote, are of more strength than all the savages from thence to Penobscot. Ostensibly, the Mayflower was headed for the Hudson River, but that was to satisfy a legal nicety requiring them to settle within the Virginia Company's grant. Georges actually encouraged the Mayflower to head for Patuxent by sharing Dermer's letter. And William Bradford acknowledged that by producing a letter in his famous Of Plymouth Plantation. The voyagers knew where they were headed, and they got there, naming their colony after Ferdinando Georges's company. What the colonists didn't know upon landing was that Tisquantum was now a captive at Pokanoka. Without him, they struggled to survive the winter while Wampanoags watched to see if they would make it. When it became clear that they would make it, Pokanoket and its sachem, Massasoit, took an enormous risk, and using Tisquantum, reached out to the newcomers. Basically, they turned Tisquantum over to the English, expecting that he would mediate between them. And indeed, Tisquantum brokered a Plymouth-Pokanoket treaty in 1621. For many people nowadays, the treaty points directly toward a happy ending at Thanksgiving that fall. But the Plymouth sources themselves make clear that the story didn't end there. Misgivings and open dissent divided Wampanoag communities, especially as it became clear that the colonists' attitudes and belligerence toward the natives were really no different from those of earlier English visitors. Most Wampanoag communities, except Pokanoket, were unhappy, and the colony soon resorted to force. John Smith had campaigned for the job as Plymouth's military commander, but the colony hired Miles Standish instead. It made little difference to native people, since Standish followed Smith's playbook anyway, forcibly collecting corn and deference from Wampanoag communities on the Cape and islands, including the now wary Epinow. Meanwhile, tensions between Pokanoket and Tisquantum resurfaced when apparently Tisquantum began going among surviving Patuxets and perhaps other Wampanoags, saying that by virtue of his ties with the English and his knowledge of their spiritual power, he would be a more effective leader for them than Massasoit. Whatever happened there, the upshot was that Tisquantum, in Bradford's words, now, quote, had to stick close by the English and never dare go from them until he dies, end quote, which Tisquantum did die in March 1622, just 1 year after brokering the treaty. With Tisquantum no longer standing between them, Massasoit solidified his ties, at least with the leadership of the colony. So we kind of know the history from there, I think. By the early 1620s, just to get back to John Smith, it was clear that he would never again travel to New England or anywhere else. His sole occupation for the last 15 years of his life was author. As his primary audience shifted from colonizers to armchair travelers, his accounts became more fanciful, featuring characters like Pocahontas and Trabixanda, and even the brief encounter at Cohasset now seemed to include some native casualties. So that's kind of what's happening with Smith. But just to wrap up now, we tend to admire the early colonizers as daring adventurers who persisted in the face of naysayers and early failures in order to realize their dreams. But one thing we need to remember, we historians like to remind people, is that they were not us or even like us. At first glance, Smith seems like the kind of rugged individualist we modern Americans like to celebrate. But underlying his boldness was a fierce insistence on rank and hierarchy, subordination of inferiors to their superiors within the English order, not to mention outside of it. And that left no room for the individualism or initiative of others. Nor did his vision of English colonization ever extend beyond establishing initial control over natives and their lands. The heroic examples he admires repeatedly in his memoirs are Julius Caesar and Hernando de Cortez, the conqueror of the Aztec Empire in Mexico. He dreamed of empires built on conquest, and not at all about how colonial societies would actually operate. But as Smith was a product of his own time, some might argue, still he had qualities we could admire. He and Georges certainly exemplified the idea that if at first you don't succeed, then try again. And that may be sound advice if someone is trying to, say, invent an airplane or start a business or achieve excellence in their chosen field. But what if their boldness, their repeated blunders, their stubbornness come at the expense of other people, those people's lives, their societies, their ways of life? Are they worthy of the same kind of admiration? Let's remember that it didn't have to be this way. Even Europeans' own accounts make clear that it didn't. Native peoples might have been happy to have some Europeans around, if only they hadn't wanted everything. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Neal, and thank everyone here for having me. I think Neal's given us a really good background of the history, and I'm going to focus a little more specifically on what colonization is. Because Neal talked about it a lot. It's something that we see, the words. I was reading some of the materials of the booklet that came out with the commemoration here, and the one line that caught my eye was that in 1606, Smith joined the Virginia Company of London, which had obtained a charter from James I to found a colony. And then it goes on to talk about what happened to him or whatever. And so it's just sort of this statement, bland, here it is, he's starting a colony. For many people in this country, the word colonization often seems to slide glibly off the tongue. And when it is used, the full aspects of its meaning are not recognized. For example, the span of Plymouth Colony was from 1620 to 1692. Plymouth Colony was absorbed by Mass Bay Colony. The English colonized this country to escape religious persecution in Europe. And today, we have colonial furniture, colonial homes, the Old Colony Gas Company, the Colonial Restaurant, which sadly isn't even there anymore, was my favorite. Such examples almost have a bland quality. We've heard them 1,000 times. They are matter of fact and commonplace. They're accepted as the way things are. So many people don't look beyond such statements. They have never had to. They didn't learn about it in school. It has just never occurred to them. But these statements do have another side. For each one, there is a reaction, a consequence, an effect on Native people. Where is this part of the history? The deeper, darker meanings of colonization have been bred out of American history. However, people still carry associated attitudes and behaviors that go unrecognized for what they actually are. The popular meaning of the word colonization is that a group of people from one place move into a new place, settle, and create their lives from there, building and forging great nations out of harsh and empty wilderness. The other side of this mythology is that there were people already in that so-called wilderness. And what about those people? What was their life? What had they built and forged? In consideration of those questions, it must be asked, what is the thinking that allows other people to feel that they have the right to just move into someone else's land as if the original people were not there or did not have any rights at all? This way of thinking does have a point of initiation, and it also has a purpose. One of the places that it stems from is a document called, now known as the Doctrine of Discovery. And these were documents that issued from the Vatican in the 15th century. And this is from an article about the Doctrine of Discovery. Under various theological and legal doctrines formulated during and after the Crusades, non-Christians were considered enemies of the Catholic faith and as such, less than human. Accordingly, in the Bull of 1452, Pope Nicholas directed King Alfonso to, quote, capture, vanquish, and subdue the Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, to put them into perpetual slavery, and to take all their possessions and property. And I always like to say, because I know people are Christian and or Catholic, that, you know, I view this as Christianity in practice and not so much in theory, because we all know that Jesus Christ, for example, would never have supported anything of this nature. So my question is, what right did the Pope have to make such determinations about people based on the fact that they weren't Christians? For some reason, he thought that he was in a position to do such a thing with other human beings, bringing into question whether they were human or not. From that, we can see that colonization is far more than moving in and setting up housekeeping and creating the American dream from there. So what then does colonization actually entail? Michael Stevenson, a lecturer at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia, wrote in his 1992 article, which was in regard to the Columbus Quincentenary. The article is called Columbus and the War on Indigenous People. And he says, it was with this encounter, a neutral word chosen by the victors, that a process of destruction, so all-encompassing and systematic, that it can only be described as total war, was inaugurated by Europeans against indigenous peoples. The central endeavor was, and still is, to lay waste a people and destroy their culture in order to undermine the integrity of their existence and appropriate their riches. For the Wampanoag, the specific aspects of colonization include the following processes. I always like to say that it's like a many-headed dragon. Well, first of all, there was a land patent from the King of England, James, and this is a summary of the 1620 Charter. And I'm just going to read a few excerpts because it's like quite a tome here. It says, for the planting, ruling, ordering, and governing of New England in America, all that part and portion of the said country called New England, and lying and being in breadth from 40 degrees northerly latitude from the equinoctial line to 48 degrees of the said northerly latitude, together also with all the firm lands, soils, grounds, creeks, inlets, havens, ports, seas, rivers, islands, waters, fishings, mines, and minerals, as well as royal mines of gold and silver, as other mines and minerals, precious stones, quarries, to have, hold, possess, and enjoy, all and singular, the aforesaid continents, lands, territories, islands, hereditaments. This is 17th century English, so it's different from today. And precincts, sea waters, fishings, with all manner their commodities, royalties, privileges, preeminences, and profits that shall arise from thence forever. Long story short, they wanted everything. And this, and my question to that is, what right did the King of England have? He was going off what the Vatican had issued, 100 or however many, 20 years earlier, whatever. But what right did they have? They didn't. Disease was one of the heads of the dragon, and even John Smith himself, in his advertisements for the unexperienced planters of New England, says, "And it seems God hath provided for this country, has provided this country for our nation, destroying the natives by the plague, yet not touching one Englishman, though many traded and were conversant among them." And he's referring there to the plague that hit through this area between 1616 and 1618, which actually started in southern Maine and swept right down the coast until it hit Narragansett Bay. That's the one Neal was referring to. It didn't touch the Narragansett because it didn't jump the bay, but it went right through the middle of Wampanoag country, and we lost anywhere from 50 to 90% of our population at that time. And we estimate that, we had some 69 villages in our territory that were an average of 1,000. A village could be 200 people to 2,000 people. So we had roughly 70,000 people in our nation. And if you think of, let's hit it in the middle, 75% of them are gone. So, and when you read the accounts of that time period and just after that happened, it's very unsettling and it's pretty scary. I think it was the worst time in the history of the Wampanoag people that's ever been recorded. Let's see. We already started on the Christianity piece, but the other thing that happened was the enforced religious conversion. Another long story short, the good Indians were the ones who converted, and the bad Indians are the ones who wanted to, continue to live in traditional manner. And I guess if we were going to stay here in our own country, the English wanted us to be like them. So we had to cut our hair, not speak our language, wear English-style clothing, dress in English-style houses, and, gosh darn it, we just didn't end up looking like English people, so I don't know where that left the English, but to, give you an effect of that, Experience Mayhew wrote a book, Indian Converts, which is about the Indians of Martha's Vineyard. And each chapter is, this is 1698, and the first Indian convert in this area was 1643 on Martha's Vineyard, a man named Coombs. And so this is 50 years later, and Mayhew's writing on the progress that the Indians are making becoming Christians. And one chapter's on the men and one's on the women, and then there's one called Pious Children. And I was reading through some of the accounts of the children, who range in age from 8 to 16, and every account I read, the child died at the end of it. And one boy named Caleb O'Hama, he was 16, and he used to drive everybody crazy. His family, his schoolmates, the preacher, anybody he passed on the street, because he just couldn't seem to go anywhere without a Bible in his hand. He was like totally OCD with the Christianity. And he was always preaching to people, just preaching and preaching, and they say, look, we can't, we get it, we get Jesus, love Jesus, it's great. We can't take you, could you just go out in the woods, do something? And he'd go out in the woods and he'd be praying, and I forget the word when you flagellate, yeah. And he sickened and eventually died. And before he died, he asked for the white minister to come and pray for him or pray with him. And he was asking to be forgiven for the state in which he was born. Now, what that meant was, as a non-Christian, AKA a Wampanoag. So I think it's quite the brainwashing if you think you have to be forgiven for whom you were born as. Because I don't think the Creator made a mistake with that. Education was another one. Harvard University, Dartmouth were all started, not just for Indians, but with Indian youth in mind. And one of their focuses was to reduce us to civility, which almost, by today's English, seems like an oxymoron, because it's going backwards or something. But, and, not that I'm bragging on Aquina here today, but the first, well, maybe I am a little bit, but the first graduate of Harvard was a man named Caleb Chisha-Tiamak in 1665. And he went home and died a year later because he contracted consumption from living in the city of Cambridge, at the time. And I remember, you might be familiar with Geraldine Brooks's book, Caleb's Crossing. Okay, and when the book came out, she spoke at the Gayhead Town Hall. And I can't remember my question to her, but she said to me, "Don't you think it's a wonderful thing that this Native American man could graduate from Harvard? Isn't that a good thing?" And I was like, yeah, if anybody can get through Harvard, I mean, kudos to them, But my thinking is, why would a Native man in the 1660s need to go to Harvard? The thinking behind that he needed to go to Harvard was that somehow our culture was lacking in education, that it was inferior, that the English way is better, and he was better off, which doesn't seem to have happened, for having gone to Harvard. He studied Latin and Greek and became kind of proficient in those languages, and so it just is not something that, worked for us. By the 1660s, there were also a body of colonial laws, which had to do with everyone, but there was a section of them that was specifically in regard to Indians. One of my favorite, she said sarcastically, was having to do with the transfer of land, because everything is about land. And the one said that, and this was in the 1660s, that's when Mashpee, Aquina, along in there had been made into reservations. That term was not used. They were called Indian plantations or Indian districts, but for all practical purposes, it was a reservation. And if a white person wanted to buy land from an Indian, they had to get a permit or a license. If they failed to get that document, then the land was forfeited to the country. I thought about that and I was like, oh, well, that's pretty slick. The Indian who owned it in the first place doesn't get to keep it, and they just both go home and whatever. No, it gets turned over to Plymouth or Boston or whichever one was the seat of power at the time. There was a system of indenture, which the English had had for however long, and they, passed that on to us when they got here. They would remove Indian children from their families to be brought up in an English household, thinking that was better, for that Indian child. And what happened was that Indian child didn't learn to speak their language or forgot it, what they had learned, depending on the age that they were indentured. They didn't know the cultural ways or customs. They didn't even know their own family. And then when they hit 18 or 21, they were not released from indenture like an English person was to go off and set up shop as a blacksmith or a cooper or whatever they might be. The indenture just sort of went into perpetuity till forever. And that was a huge disruption because we had huge numbers of people who weren't speaking the language, who were at odds with their own family members, who didn't know the cultural ways, maybe thought they were weird because of the way that they'd been brought up, or they just, you hear something every day and you kind of start to think like that. So if they're brought up like that, it sets them against the rest of their own people. There was a whole system of indebtedness where Native people were forced into debt for one reason or another. And one of the things that they could always pay with was land. When this whole not reservation system was designed, people were allotted parcels of land. That in itself was very disruptive to our traditional way, because any given village, people lived all together in a winter site, and then they spread out in single-family planting sites in the summer, which were from 1 to 2 acres each. And then there were other areas where people, and maybe commonly 2 or 3 villages might go hunting over here, or this is where you get the blueberries or the herring or whatever it might be. And that whole system is interrupted if this family has 20 acres over here, but that's where the blueberries were. And now you've got people, at odds about that. There was a great deal of psychological warfare. And this is something that Jesse Baird talks about when Native people were learning the English language. They were given examples that, going back and forth between English and Wampanoag, where the English person might say something like, in the middle of the winter, well, why don't you wear a hat? Well, I couldn't find mine. And the whole thing was set up to communicate the message that this person the Indian person was lazy or stupid or incompetent or whatever. So there was that kind of subliminal level of, stuff that was going on. And I think, in 1643, Roger Williams published A Key into the Language of the Americas, which is actually the Narragansett language. But in the beginning of the book, he talks about having a conversation with these 2 Narragansett men, and he's asking them where they came from. Because apparently in Europe at the time, people had huge discourses of where we came from, because certainly it couldn't have been here like our histories tell us. So other people are, trying to decide where it was that we all came from. And these men responded to him by saying, "We have grown and sprung here like the very trees of this place." Now that might sound kind of whimsical or something like that, but when I heard it, I was like, oh, okay, because some of our creation history tells us that the Creator made us from pine trees. Those are our relatives. And Williams, however, was like, I don't think so. He says, no, I don't believe them. I think they're lost. So somehow he felt he was in a position to make this decision about this nation of people. I don't believe them, me, one guy, Roger Williams, so they must be lost. And that's, just a particular, type of arrogance, really. All of these things were designed to relegate Native people to certain conditions, to assimilate them or to annihilate them. Natives were not acceptable as themselves. They had to change. The goal of all of this was to obtain the land. And these are all things, a lot of times people have trouble hearing this, and you're not alone. It's hard for us to hear it too, or read it. But these are things that happened. This is part of the history. You might not know it, you might not have been taught it in school, but this is stuff that happened, you know, if you wanted to dig back through the records or whatever. My feeling is that since they are history, this is the history that America was built on, and it formulated what America has grown into and what it is today. Now, all of this history that I've just outlined, it's been omitted, distorted, or whitewashed. The history that most people receive through the educational system has been made comfortable or acceptable. But whom does this comfort and acceptability serve? It does not serve Native people, but rather keeps us relegated to stereotype, misconception, and erasure. As a result, we have become not real people. I wish I had a nickel for every time somebody asked me, or I've heard someone else ask, "Are you a real Indian?" The person asking has no perception of us as real people from a different culture in today's world. So therefore, there's a lot of ignorance about our actual ways and cultures. There's a lot of times a denial. I've had arguments for practically about people about some of this stuff, and it's like, to me, it's not arguable, it's just what happened. If it makes someone uncomfortable, if they don't want to hear it, that's one thing, but they happened nevertheless. A friend of mine was brought into a college in Connecticut to start a Native Studies program. And apparently her department head didn't appreciate the whole effort and was constantly, trying to undermine, what my friend was trying to do, and at one point even told her that Native studies are not relevant. Okay, and that has to do because, we're the smallest population of people in the country. We make up somewhere between 1% and 2%. Every Indian in the continental United States, every tribe, we make up 1% to 2% of the entire population of this country. So I guess that makes us not relevant. Sorry, I'm a big woman, I got a big attitude, and I'm gonna have to disagree with that one. 'Cause I'm here, my people are here, we're relevant. To me, it's as simple as that. And I've had a person years ago at Plymouth. I can't remember what I was saying, but I was talking about Indian people, or I was a Native person, and they said, "You're not a person, you're an Indian." Now, to me, that just smacks of what comes out of the educational system. We still listen to the stuff about our ways being backward, or we can't go backward, we can't live the way we did because of this reason, that reason, and 5 other reasons. So it's okay if we keep producing styrofoam. Kitty and I were having a big old discussion about Dunkin' Donuts agreeing to not use styrofoam cups due to the pressure from a 5th grade somewhere. So I don't know what they're going to do, but that's the good news of the day here, I guess. And because we're considered to still be backward and all of that, the complexity and the depth of Native cultures is not addressed, it's not acknowledged, it's not understood. It just astounds me, speaking of environmental concerns, that we lived here for 15,000 years. And when the English did come here in the 17th century, they often described it as a paradise because it was the first growth forest, huge trees, millions of animals, fish, and that was, our life was a purposeful construct. We didn't live the way we did because we couldn't think anything better to do. We lived the way we did on purpose because that kept us in balance with the way the Creator created the earth. So all of this speaks to the need for a more holistic presentation of history. That does not mean changing history, but adding back in the things that should have been included in the first place. Certain events, practices, people's reactions, and actions regarding those events. The events of history have a right to be expressed simply by virtue of their having happened. They also need to be related in appropriate context and relation to one another, which will give a truer, more comprehensive telling of the past, the big picture, not just a corner of the screen. I believe that all people, all of us, are responsible for history, not for the events of the past. We cannot change those now, but we can be aware and knowledgeable of history. We can have an understanding of it, and let that understanding bring us to a point of respect that ensures that processes such as colonization do not continue to happen. A respect which affords other people the humanity and dignity which was given to them by our Creator. Thank you.